There we go.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're pleased to have you, and we have a wonderful program with two speakers, and actually a third might be joining us who has an affiliation on the board of Cumberland Cemetery, and Karl Ikerman. But before I introduce anyone here further, I wanted to just give a little background information to just share what our mission is as the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Rhode Island, an affiliate of the National Funeral Consumers. So the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Rhode Island is a nonprofit organization protecting the consumer's rights to choose meaningful and affordable funerals. We have a website, www.funerals-rhodeisland.org, and our mailbox is still at the Westminster Unitarian Church, where we first began as an organization in 1979, a group of interested citizens of different religious identities founded the Memorial Society of Rhode Island. And that was at the Westminster Unitarian Church in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. The society was incorporated under Rhode Island law 1 year later, and the society's primary purpose was to provide consumer education on funeral and cemetery costs for its members and the general public. The society became an affiliate of the Continental Association of Funeral and Memorial Societies and has paid dues to this group or its successor ever since. In May of 2006, seeking board members and desiring to expand the general membership, founding members called a meeting to revitalize and reorganize the society. The revived society set an ambitious agenda. The new board approved a mission statement and changed the society's name to the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Rhode Island. The national parent organization is the National Funeral Consumers Alliance. And our mission now is to protect the rights to choose meaningful options for burial or cremation, educate consumers, provide statewide price information to keep funeral homes and directors transparent in the services that they provide, and supply resources and encourage pre-planning so that people can understand and have support through their process of pre-planning. So our role and mission has expanded, and we continue to get people calling us, utilizing our newsletters, our websites, asking questions about what their rights are. And we meet monthly to hold sessions so that we can discuss what we're going to do in the future. So today we're very excited because so much has happened in the last several years, especially post-COVID and during COVID. It really made people really think about their own final wishes. So we're here today to discuss the topic on green burial. And we have two very knowledgeable individuals who I will introduce. So the first person that I will introduce is Robin Weber. Robin Weber is the president of Prudence Memorial Park. Prudence Memorial Park is a lifelong she is a lifelong visitor and now full-time resident of Prudence Island. Even as a child, Robin considered the absence of a cemetery on the island to serve as a final resting place odd, given the strong sense of place and community shared by its residents. Following a career in natural resource management, Robin was able to realize a lifelong dream and establish a cemetery for use by the local community. As a steward of natural areas, the only suitable option was to make the cemetery green and provide a natural burial option for the general public as well. Our second speaker is Anthony Hollingshead, who is a graduate of the New England Institute for Applied Arts and Sciences, with further studies at Mount Ida College in Newton and the ICCFA University. He began his cemetery career in 1985 at Forest Hill Cemetery in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. He came to Swan Cemetery in 2005. He has had the opportunity to serve in many capacities with the cemetery field, gaining knowledge in many areas of the industry. Anthony was elected to the position of president of Swan Point in 2007. Anthony has served as the president of the Massachusetts and New England Cemetery Associations. He serves as a board member of the Blackstone Parks Conservancy of Providence. He is a current member of the Rotary Club of Providence and Rotary District 7950. So without further ado, I will ask whoever wants to speak first to come on up.
Oh, no, they'll stay.
Oh,
right there. Yeah.
they'll stay seated and have their voice heard. Thank you.
Do you have a choice on who would like to go first? Okay, Anthony's going to go first. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to go back and so Anthony, I think that you can share your screen. That should work. Great. You might want to go to, yeah, start slideshow. There you go. And I'm just going to mute myself, Anthony, and
there we go. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to speak with all of you this afternoon. My name is Anthony Hollingshead, as Ann so aptly sort of announced with this long introduction of myself, but thank you. It's great to be.
Anthony, I think you have to unmute yourself. On the far left corner.
Just
line going through.
Yeah, I don't see that yet. I can hear myself.
I can hear you.
Great.
You just need to turn the volume down on that laptop.
okay. So
how's that?
I can still hear you.
Can you all hear me on Zoom? Great. Well,
Yeah.
It's really nice to be here with you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to the Consumer Alliance for allowing me to spend this time with Robin too, to share, and the gentleman from Arnold Mill Cemetery. It's just great to be here with you all. If you asked me in 2007 if we were going to consider green burial, I would have told you most unlikely not. It was a topic that was relatively new to us at Swan Point Cemetery. And I will confess that I was a little bit leery about sort of exploring the options. So we kind of let it just rest. But in 2017, we started to really witness a lot of interest from our community. A lot of people were coming into the cemetery and they were saying, we're hearing all about green burial. When is Swan Point going to offer you green burial? And we didn't really know much about it. We had heard it was more of an out west kind of thing. So the East Coast wasn't doing much in the way of green burial. But then it became a more popular topic amongst other groups. Funeral directors, we were getting a lot of inquiries from funeral directors who wanted to know when we were going to offer green burial. And then your group, the Consumer Alliance, probably the most persistent group that was interested in green burial. So I guess you guys were the ones that made us turn the tide at Swan Point Cemetery. So we started to explore the option of green burial at Swan Point Cemetery in 2017. So according to the Green Burial Council, green burial, a natural burial, is a process by which all components go into the earth and they are biodegradable. Caskets, the individual, in some cases clothing. As a concern for the environment steadily grows, interest in green burial has also become more common and more day to day. This study happens to be a little bit old, but it's still relative. According to the National Funeral Directors Association, 72% of cemeteries are receiving increased demand for green burial, and 54%, and I suspect that number is a little higher now, 54% of all Americans would consider green burial. This is a compilation of information that was produced by the Education Committee of the Green Burial Council. So some of the reasons that people choose green burial, why. So on the top graph, top line, minimizing impact on the environment. That makes a lot of sense. So people want to do as little sort of interruption to the environment as possible. That makes sense. No monuments, no vaults, no liners, nothing that's going to be interrupting burial ground. Back to old traditions. The cost, in some cases, it can be less expensive. You're buying less product, spiritual or religious reasons, and you do-it-yourself ethic, which makes a lot of sense. Those who choose green burial might have chosen as an alternative, if green burial was not an option, cremation and scattering, cremation and interment, conventional burial with embalming and viewing, and direct burial in a conventional cemetery lot. Level of education, this plays a little bit part in it. So those choosing green burial, if you have an undergraduate or associate's degree, you're more likely to be interested and choose green burial. More than one college degree, a little less. High school diploma only, a little less. And the least amount to choose would be less than a high school diploma. So more education about what the process is, more inclined to choose green burial. Economic status. If you're in the medium, sort of 1/3 wage earner, you're up at the top of the list. A high upper third, you're sort of second down, and so on and so on. So the very poor are less likely to select green burial. How do people hear about green burial? Cemetery website, word of mouth, public speaking presentations, listening to the Green Burial Council, education of funeral directors, hospice care, paid print advertising, paid online advertising, tables at fairs, conferences, meetings like this. So when we finally decided that Swan Point was going to embark on green burial, we thought, this is really a new topic to us. We need to explore all of the options, all of the elements that will go into making a successful green burial spot section. And we started by inviting funeral directors to engage in the conversation. So we had a meeting at the cemetery. It was a luncheon. We had this brochure that you can see in front of you that was all prepared to talk about how Swan Point Cemetery was going to embark on green burial. It was going to have to be a relationship that was a cooperative relationship between the cemetery and the funeral directors. So we were discussing things about if a body was coming to the cemetery unembalmed, how long would you wait before the burial took place? There were parameters there was no preservation. We wanted to get that burial taken care of as quickly as we could. Would they have eco-friendly burial containers to offer? Would they participate in the process of burials and so forth? One of the things I'll talk about in just a second is the fact that we still use a lot of mechanical equipment to open graves and so forth, and I'll get into that in a second. But we really wanted to make sure that we were hearing from the funeral directors that we're all on the same page as to how we would progress with opening up a green burial section. Pretty successful meeting. We also visited a number of cemeteries. We wanted to make sure, again, to get it right. It was going to be a sort of once and done for a little while as we developed a new section for green burial. So we visited Mount Auburn Cemetery, who has offered green burial for quite some time, but they do things a little differently than we do. Because Mount Auburn is pretty much filled to capacity, there's not a lot of space. What they'll do is something called infill. They'll take a look throughout the cemetery, and for example, here might be a pathway that's not used anymore, an old roadway that was covered up. And they will take some of these identified spaces and use them for green burial. So they're pocketed throughout the cemetery in different locations. We invited a representative from the Green Burial Council, Candace Curry, who is also the Director of Planning, Cemetery, and Development at Mount Auburn Cemetery, to come and meet with our Buildings and Grounds Committee. We have a pretty formal board, and we wanted to have them have the opportunity to ask any questions. So it was a great, very sort of interactive meeting, got a lot of information out of it. And we had a board member who also had an acquaintance in New York. Whitehaven Memorial Park in Pittsford, New York, has had green burial for quite some time. And he went out there, visited them, had a conversation with them, talk about what they offered. They offer for quite some time, have offered a wildflower meadow that is home to some of the nesting bluebirds in the area. When you get to see pictures of Swan Point, you'll see that some of the turf is probably a little bit more groomed than some of the wildflower meadows. When we get to that point, I'll talk a bit about that. But they were great and cooperative to explain some of their options and how they had developed their sections, some of their memorialization options. One of the things too that we thought was really critical was if we were going to offer green burial, that we would need to be certified. You know, the Green Burial Council, as Robin can attest to, and the gentleman from Arnold Mills will attest to that, you know, if you're certified by the Green Burial Council, that's the gold standard of the industry for certifying green burial. We wanted to make sure that we're approved by them and certified. Took a little bit of a process to become certified, but we did. I won't go into a lot of great detail about their categories of green burial, but our green burial classifications. But the standards for cemetery include there are three actually categories: hybrid cemeteries, which we are, which would be a traditional cemetery that has green burial option, natural burial ground, and a conservation burial ground, which is much more stringent in some of the regulations that they require. I'll stick with just hybrid cemeteries because that's what Swan Point is. And obviously the first is a conventional cemetery, which Swan Point is, offers the option for burial without the need of a vault lid, concrete box, slab, or partitioned liner. No embalming required or allowed, actually. If an individual is embalmed, the requirement would be, through the funeral directors that are green certified as well, they would be using an approved non-toxic chemical and must allow for any kind of eco-friendly burial containers. If you're a hybrid cemetery and you're green burial certified, you would have to accurately represent your earned level of certification in cemetery publications, your website, conversations with the public, etc. Develop a maintenance and operations manual to be utilized by all staff members. There's a little bit of a different process in taking care of green burial sections, and establish an endowment fund to ensure the long-term maintenance of the site by setting aside at least 10% of all burial plot sales. Now, the state law in Rhode Island is 20%, and Swan Point exceeds that, but there's a minimum of a 10% setting aside of funds from whatever property you sell. And according to the Green Burial Council, we are considered a hybrid cemetery, meaning a conventional cemetery offering green burial options. We became certified in 2019. Picking out the spot was really important. Now, a lot of thought went into this because if you've been to Swan Point Cemetery, you know, it's a very heavily treed cemetery, and the periphery of Swan Point Cemetery is very heavily forested, quite beautiful, actually. A lot of those areas would lend themselves to a beautiful spot for green burial. But my hesitancy was that we wanted to make sure that this space that we developed was somewhat visible, so that if you had visitors and so forth, they could see some of the activity, and I'll get into that in just a little bit later. But we identified a spot in the cemetery that was a natural area. It's a little bit over 1/4 of an acre, and it's an elliptical shaped section, and it's been historically called the Ellipse, and it's just this great little spot to visit in the middle of the cemetery. We identified that as a place to use for green burial, And it's really worked out really well. You can see the interior portion of this is relatively flat, turf, with a beautiful peripheral planting of old rhododendrons. So although it's a private area, it's also easily accessible to anywhere else in the cemetery. Not a particularly bright picture, but this gives you an example of what it was like before we developed it. This is a map of the entire cemetery. If you can see that highlighted little elliptical spot at the sort of the northeast section of the cemetery, that's where the ellipse is, sort of in the historic core. And for those of you on Zoom, I don't know how well you can see this diagram, but this is a layout that a company called Griever and Ward out of Orchard Park, New York Cemetery. They're landscape architects, very big in cemetery design, came out and laid out this ellipse for us for green burial. The trees exist. So those trees that you see there are actually there. Those sort of white outlined sort of blocks around the periphery of the ellipse are existing old family lots, rather large lots, so that you can see it's sort of sandwiched in between the old historic core of the cemetery. We also wanted to make sure that this section would last. I know that the Green Burial Council would say to you anywhere between 500 and 600 graves per acre would be what they consider to be appropriate, and that's where we are. You'll see that they're very linear, and on the next slide, I'll show you the way they're actually laid out. But there are 145 graves laid out in this particular spot. A more detailed layout of the actual grave itself. A standard grave at Swan Point Cemetery is 3.5 feet by 10 feet. So that affords you space to have a monument at the head of the grave. And typically the graves are side by side with almost no space in between. But if you notice, one of the things here, and I think probably Robin will speak to this as well, I think, and when you are laying out graves with no vaults, no liners, your ability to dig, and especially with Swan Point, because we are not going to be digging by hand, you really have to exercise a lot of caution when you're opening up a grave so that you're not disrupting an adjacent grave. It's really key. Now you throw on top of that a snowstorm and bad weather and slippery and messy grounds. It makes it that much more difficult. But in this diagram, you'll notice that these graves measure 3 feet by 8 feet, which is about the size of a standard grave. But there's 2 feet that's separating each grave. And so you have a space in between every single grave, so that if you're opening that grave with a piece of equipment, there's very little likelihood that you'd be disrupting an adjacent burial. So you're using more space when you're laying out green burial space. A little bit more of a clear image of that. That white rectangle in the middle of the image is the memorial ledger. We thought that we would be good with one. It's a 6 by 8 or 5 or 6 foot by 8 foot piece of granite that would allow the inscription of those interred in the ellipse. So if you buy space, if you buy the right to be buried in the ellipse, you get the option of having your name inscribed on that ledger as well. So there's no monumentation on every grave, no other decoration, just that central ledger that would identify those that are buried in the ellipse. In Rhode Island, oddly enough, and a lot of the states throughout the country, there's not a lot of direction as to the depth of burials and requirements. One would find that pretty surprising. The old standard sort of adage is that when you're making a burial, typically the bottom of that casket would be about 6 feet in the ground. We were able to uncover some regulations that Vermont had recently passed, stating that the burial of a human body must be at least 3.5 feet deep, measured from the natural surface of the ground to the bottom of the outside coffin. So when you think about that, if you're measuring 3.5 feet from the bottom of that casket, which can be in some cases almost 2 feet high, you're talking 1.5 feet, maybe 2 feet of ground cover, a fill above that casket. Well, that's the minimum that we would sort of find acceptable. And when I talked to you about how I would chat with you about the depth of burials that we perform at Swan Point, we do a burial of a green burial, and it is a 6 foot deep opening for a burial. And although the Green Burial Council would say to you that decomposition is much more effective the closer the body is to the surface, and I'm sure that that's the case, we were very concerned, or I in particular was very concerned and expressed my concern to the board that years down the road, if the community realized that you were burying these bodies without any kind of outer container and no outer protection, we wanted to make sure that that body was completely protected. You know, in my position, liability is always a concern. So my concern was if you're burying bodies that have a foot and a half of topsoil over the actual burial, that accessibility to the body might be a concern. So we wanted to make sure that we were making that burial extra deep. And I know that I'm probably one of the only people that gets very concerned about that, but you know, as society changes, people get more inquisitive. If they found out that these bodies are buried without any outer protection, I was a bit concerned about that. So we do, all of our burials are performed at 6 feet. If you buy a space in the ellipse, you're buying a right of interment. So you're not buying the space, you're not paying for the land, you're buying the right of interment. And with that, you get a deed or a grant of a right of interment that specifically says that all bodies are irretrievable. So if you bury an individual in a regular standard cemetery, very unlikely to happen, but someone can come and say, listen, we're transferring her to another cemetery to be with other family. It's not a possibility with green burial. Once the decomposition process starts, it's going to be pretty much not a possibility. So our deeds or our grants of rights will state that the body is irretrievable. Each grave at the ellipse will allow 1 casketed burial or 2 sets of cremated remains. And when we first, in 2017, started to talk about this, we were trying to decide whether we would allow only caskets to be buried in the ellipse. And the general consensus at that point was yes. But then we thought, well, we had a lot of questions saying if an individual had a spouse or partner that was cremated, how are we going to handle this? So we decided that we would allow cremation burials as well. So in a green burial space, 1 space, we would allow a casket or 2 sets of cremated remains, both obviously having to be in biodegradable containers, no vaults, no liners. Burial container, simple casket with water wicker, free of toxic materials. These are all green burial standard requirements from the Green Burial Council, held together with wooden dowels, no paint, varnishes, shrouded bodies are permitted, but must be enclosed in a biodegradable casket. One of the options that a lot of green burial cemeteries will afford is transporting an individual that is simply shrouded on a board. And we, here again, bearing in mind that there are a lot of shades of green. So we wanted to ensure that we had good safety for our employees. And we were a little reticent about having individuals transported from a hearse to the gravesite in just a shroud. Now, you need to bear in mind that these bodies are not in bond. And hopefully they're getting these individuals to the cemetery before any decomposition takes place. But in the event that there's a problem, we didn't want to subject any of our employees to any health hazards. And so we require some sort of an outer container, a wicker casket, a wooden casket. When we decided that we would identify the graves, we wanted to make sure, because there were no monuments, that you could find these graves. We don't have GPS, nothing that technologically advanced. And we decided that we would identify the graves in a very historic manner by using granite corner posts. We found that over a period of time, the old historic granite posts wouldn't shift, they'd stay in place, very permanent. So these granite posts were custom created. They go down to the ground 2 feet. Each grave has an identifying number. But because we wanted to make sure that the area looked very sort of natural, these grave numbers will cover over a period of time. The turf will cover them up, you won't see them. The ledger, as I spoke to you about, is a beautifully planted ledger in the section of that group. An individual gets buried there. They have their option of year of birth, year of death, name only. When we started out, we had 1. We thought that would be sufficient. This is a picture of a more recent layout with 3 ledgers in the group. and 2 of them are pretty much filled now. Floral tributes, natural flowers only. If you're placing flowers in the grave when the individual is getting buried, a single stem flower, fresh cut bouquet of flowers on the gravesite, no artificial containers, no artificial flowers, and only natural flowers are allowed for decoration of the grave sites. We wanted to make sure that we had the tools in place so that our community could learn about green burial. And this is an image of our website. So if you're clicking on our website, which I know a lot of you have probably done, you click on it, there's a whole section of green burial. Tells you all about the options at Swan Point, some of the requirements, and advertising. When we were opening up the green burial section in 2019, we got the word out. This is an advertisement that was done in the Providence Monthly magazine, talking about our new area. Are you thinking about green burial? The opening, and I think if you look at that picture on the right-hand side, you'll see some of the pretty recognizable faces there. We had an opening, and a lot of the individuals from this alliance were there. Very successful event to share with our community. A lot of publication. We had a lot of reporters there that day, just sort of a tribute to the fact that it is a very interesting sort of topic for a lot of the media. We had probably 3 people from the media that day, a lot of coverage. Providence Journal, GoLocal.prov, an online presence, Providence Journal. I was on TV. We just had a lot of coverage of that, and including your wonderful newsletter from the Consumer Alliance. So thank you for that support. We have found that this particular section, I was talking to Robin a little bit about this and Anne a little bit about this before we started the presentations here, that when we developed the ellipse, there were 145 graves that were laid out. And that was in 2019 when it was opened up. And at this point, we've sold 79. So we're more than half sold out. It's been a very popular option. Number on hold 10. So 10 individuals have reserved space, burials to date. We've interred 17 individuals in that particular area, non-saleable 13. So there are graves that are laid out within that area that are not sellable because of trees and so forth. And so the unsold graves remaining are 43. So we're really in a position where we need to think about developing more space for green burial. It's a very, very popular option for us. The retail cost of a grave is $4,825, $4,825. And it's a little bit more expensive than a standard grave. With green burial, there's a little bit more care. There's a little bit more follow-up care with graves and so forth, because you're burying in containers that are biodegradable and over a period of time will settle a little bit. So it's constantly checking those graves to make sure they're in good shape. One of the things I wanted to share with you was an image of a cemetery in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. There's a very large historic cemetery called West Laurel Hill Cemetery in the city of Philadelphia. They have 2 cemeteries, one's older than the other, West and East Laurel Hill. And they just developed a green burial space, which I think is particularly lovely. And the image, which should be up on your right-hand side, shows the very natural green space for the green burial on either side of this beautifully turfed walkway. I think this is a very nice design. When I started to talk in the beginning of this presentation, we talked about New York having a wildflower meadow for green burials. And that's what this particular cemetery has, but access to it is on a more turfed spot to get to the section. The picture lower than that shows that probably more clearly. Although a wildflower meadow is really quite beautiful, our concern was access, making sure that you had stable ground, trying to find the grave. To me, it probably would pose a little bit more difficulty in maintaining it. These cemeteries will cut these wildflower meadows twice a year so they don't get reforested. But it's depending on whatever cemetery wants to decide as far as style and design. But I think this is a very nice example of well-done green burial space. This is their original green burial area. That's very sort of planted with wildflower plantings on the left-hand side. And this is probably a 15 or a 16-year-old section, very successful. Volunteers replanting that group. So they have a lot of activity, a lot of interest, a lot of support for green burial in West Laurel Hill Cemetery. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation, and I would say that, again, if you asked me in 2017, if green burial was going to be a popular option, I would have said to you no. And here we are. It's one of the most popular options at Swan Point Cemetery. Very successful. We'll be thinking about developing new space. But I'm going to close by thanking the Alliance for kind of giving us that little push to offer our community something that was very valuable and very much needed. If you have the opportunity, there are a couple of documentaries that you really should try to see. A Will for the Woods and also Steel Mantown Cemetery Company, how they develop their cemeteries into green burial spaces. Very well done documentaries. So thank you again for letting me share with you a little bit about Swan Point's green burial option. We're really looking forward to hearing Robin's presentation as well. I think she's done a nice job, so I'm very excited about that. And thank you to Janet and Ann for inviting me here today. I appreciate that very much. So, and thank you for those of you on Zoom.
Janet, you're muted.
Thank you, Allie. Okay, so thank you so much, Anthony. That was a wonderful presentation. And I think Ann wants to say a few words before Robin speaks.
Anthony has been so open and kind and receptive to when the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Rhode Island attempted to speak with him, and then he went to the board and spoke with them. And if that had not happened, if he weren't as receptive and open, this would not have occurred. So we are very, very grateful and excited that he was open and receptive. So thank you, Anthony. We can't thank you enough. And we hope that continued success for the ellipse and any other section that opens thereafter.
Thank you.
And now I would like to introduce again to you Robin Weber, who is the owner and resident of Prudence Island Memorial Park, where she conducts a variety of educational programs. She goes out to speak on green burial, and she was kind enough to take the ferry over to the mainland here this morning. And we'd like to welcome Robin Weber.
Thank you. Do I need to do something?
Got it. Oh, do you want to?
I forgot my presentation. See, I knew there was going to be something I would have to do. No, that's not it. How do I get back to this one? See, I'm not seeing that.
Go try to see where you do a green arrow to make that company that bigger. Now you should.
No, I can. Share. Okay. Sorry, technical difficulties.
And then you have to share.
Share on this one though.
Yeah. The blue right there. Kind of share. There you
go. Okay. Is it gonna go? Yeah, there we go. So that was awesome, Anthony. And thank you all for having me over here. I think you're gonna see between his presentation and mine the difference between a professional and not, right? So Prudence Memorial Park is a little bit different than Swan Point. And I really wanted to accomplish two things today. One is, what do we offer at Prudence Memorial Park? And then also kind of talk about what it would look like if you choose a green burial, things to consider in advance of, and on the day of, and after the fact. So with that, about the park, it's brandy new, right? Just established in 2019. I didn't do much by way of marketing during COVID. I just thought that was tacky, so I didn't. The park itself is 3.2 acres and it's a natural area. It is on Prudence Island, which means you have to get there via ferry, which is not that big of a deal, but it is something to consider. The ferry leaves from Bristol. It is also certified as a natural burial ground. And it's a good thing Anthony went first because he gave you all the technical dirt on what that means. But as a reminder, right, a natural burial ground is one that only permits green burials. So I cannot have anything other than green on the property. And I want to emphasize that it is designed and operated and maintained to produce a naturalistic appearance. So that influences everything that can and can't happen on the park. There are 3 main characteristics common to all certified green cemeteries, and that is no vaults, non-toxic preparation of the body, and also organic materials for the container, whatever that may be. So what do I offer at Prudence Memorial Park, right? So I offer the pre-purchase of burial rights. So similar to Swan Point, you do not buy a location, a spot in the cemetery, you buy a general area. You're essentially securing a place in the park in one of 4 general locations, 5 if you're a veteran. And the reason for that is that Prudence Memorial Park practice sequential burials. So rather than have holes punched all over the place in random fashion, we minimize disturbance to a specific area that's usually accommodates 6 to 12 graves. And once it's fully utilized, then it's allowed to go back to its natural state. So if a tree comes up or a shrub comes up or the grasses flow over it, well, that's okay too. One thing I cannot pre-sell at the park is the cost of the burial itself. That's just a requirement under the law. Neither can I sell funeral products. So those are some restrictions at the park. I offer a full body interment in 2 varieties. And Anthony is fascinated by this. No, I'm kidding. So one of them is successive burial. So in which you're purchasing burial rights, in which the space can be reused after a period of 60 years. So that provides sustainability into the future, not only for the property, you know, for the actual land itself, but also for the cemetery, because it will never become a historic cemetery. There will always be an opportunity, active burials happening, income stream happening, so that there's somebody is always maintaining it into the future. If that is not to your liking, you can also purchase perpetual burial rights, which means that space is yours forever and always and cannot be reused. And although I'm not a huge fan, I do offer opportunity to inter or niche placement or scattering of cremains, just mostly because there's still an interest in that. So on the park, I offer 2 types of memorialization, and those are fieldstone markers and native plantings. So fieldstone markers sit flush to the ground. There's a maximum size limit, and they cannot be machine cut or polished. So no hard edges, like anything like that. The one trick about the fieldstone markers is they do not necessarily and likely won't sit on the grave itself. And the reason is, again, we're trying to promote the natural vegetation of the area. So having a stone, you know, across the landscape periodically is not conducive to that. So they would instead be near the trails or near the benches and clustered together to minimize disturbance. For native plants, when you plant depends on what you select. The commemorative planting guide allows you to select from a predetermined list, which increases biodiversity on the site, hopefully attracts more wildlife use, and contributes to privacy screening. But honestly, any native plant would do. Like, even if I've got a dozen red maples, if that is your choice, that's okay as well. The trick, however, is that if it is a tree as a selection, that also cannot go on the grave itself. The reason being, I don't know at what time in the future I would be excavating the adjacent grave. And if I were to excavate the adjacent grave, I would potentially injure or harm the tree that has been planted as a memorialization for somebody, and I don't want to do that. So you can do it there, and there are opportunities nearby, flowering tree under as an understory tree. It's worth noting, I think, that what's not allowed, right, is anything, no plastic flowers, no vases, no pictures in or out of a frame, nothing that's man-made or manufactured can be left on the grave or in the park itself, with one exception. I do allow for commemorative flags on the graves and veteran administration plaques on the graves of those who have served the armed forces. So that's the one exception to that rule. So it all sounds good, right? Sign me up. And things you need to really think about if you're choosing green. And I have some very lovely conversations with folks who are trying to determine if it's right for them and if that's what they want to do. But the first and foremost is who is preparing the body and who is doing the transportation. In the state of Rhode Island, you can, or a representative after you passed, can get the death certificate, can get a burial transit permit, can pick you up and put you in the back of the car and bring you over. That's a lot to ask, right? That's something you want to think about. If it's somebody you're designating to do that, make sure they are both willing and able to do that work. And it really is probably only going to happen, maybe not only going to happen, but it most likely would happen in a situation where you're also doing a home vigil or home funeral as well. It makes a lot of sense that the family would then, or an individual will contribute to that. For most people who look at me like that's crazy talk, I recommend that they use a funeral home to actually perform those activities for them. So they're getting the paperwork, they're doing the transportation, they're doing the preparation of the body. You need to think about what is your choice for coffin, casket, or shroud, and whatever will you wear, if anything, right? So the Green Burial Council does have a certification for funeral product providers as well. So you can look it up, find out what's available online. It's remarkable where you can buy a coffin. You can buy them on Amazon if you so choose. It's very interesting. Really, it doesn't matter at Prudence Memorial Park what your choice is, but what you need to be thinking about is it natural? Are there fasteners as part of that? If there are, they cannot be brass, they cannot be chrome, and they need to be minimal. So I have a friend who has been making me a demonstration coffin casket, and he's told me just how tricky it is to put those together with no fastener, no fasteners at all. And the reality is they don't have to be without, they just have to be minimal. And obviously, I think as Anthony had mentioned, be careful of the types of finishes and adhesives in the products that you're using, because you do not want to be creating toxic byproducts as those materials degrade. About shrouding, shrouded body does need some form of support. There are shrouds that are made with boards actually sewn into them. Others have a channel which you can add a board to at a later date prior to the burial. But if you want to use grandma's old quilt, you're welcome to do so. You just need to put a board, incorporate that in the shroud and make sure that's good and tight. And I do not require any exterior vessel for a shrouded body. So who would officiate at your, I mean, these are things you're thinking about. Do you want to have military honors? How many people do you anticipate? Is this going to be a very small group? Is it going to be a large group? And that comes into play in a little bit. So more than anything, tell people you could have your whole funeral worked out in your mind, but unless you're telling somebody what you want, that is not what your wishes, that's not what's going to happen on the day of. So let them know what your plan is. And I have, and you know, this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, but I have people say to me, well, I don't really care because I'm dead and it doesn't matter. And it's like, well, what you're doing is passing the responsibility for making those decisions to somebody else, which isn't very kind. So do make a plan. What to think about when the time arrives, right? When it's time for the burial. One is ferry reservations. If you're coming to Prudence, you know, that might limit the days and times that you would want to be conducting a burial at the park. Do bring on-island transportation. The distance between the ferry and the cemetery is only 1.5 miles. And I don't mind picking people up and giving a ride over to the cemetery, but to shuffle 30 people back and forth, well, that takes a lot of the time that would otherwise be better spent, you know, kind of being part of the service and the process of burial itself. If there are people with mobility issues, recall this is a natural area, right? So you're taking essentially a walk in the woods. So that, you know, if there's somebody who's coming to attend, I can borrow a golf cart of some kind and get you near enough to the grave site. Typically, there is no motorized vehicle use on the property itself, but I can arrange for that. If you or your loved one is 7 feet tall, that's something I would want to know before you arrive. I'm just saying, there's a standard size for the grave, and that standard size would not accommodate over large people, and that would be awkward to show up and not have the appropriate grave. And then just, you know, consider appropriate dress for the specific site and the weather. So what am I up to before you get there? Well, I typically am hoping to have at least a 48 hours notice and a notification of any, or communication of anything you want specific on the day of. You know, I am working and working to get the grave site dug and prepared. There's a fair amount that goes into that. I do use an excavator on the site, and I do dig a shallow grave. The one thing that people don't appreciate, I think, is that in that excavation, the soil strata is actually removed in layers and put in separate piles so that it can be returned in reverse order. So your topsoil is back on top when you're all done. And that helps to, again, regenerate the vegetation. The setup of the actual grave site before anybody arrives depends on what your selection was for a container. Are you going to be using a shrouding board, which is another alternative? Are you going to have a casket or coffin of some kind? So on arrival, this is the part I really don't like, but as awkward as it is, I do need documentation. I can't bury anybody without the appropriate documentation in the form of a cremation or a death certificate or a burial transit permit, because I need to know who it is, and that becomes part of the permanent record. The purchase agreement, if it hasn't been pre-purchased, needs to take place at that time. And the reason is that on that purchase agreement, and typically people do have an opportunity to prepay for that. There is a little checkbox that says, I have read the rules and regulations of Prudence Memorial Park, and I understand what the limitations are. So I will hold you to that in the future. And also the receipt for funeral services, which is something that needs to be paid at the time of need. And on that receipt, I also capture information that gets included in the burial register. So all the, this is who this individual was, and that's part of, again, part of the permanent record. Then after all the paperwork is done, I get to have an opportunity to actually meet and greet everybody who's there and go with them over the process, what they can expect when they're there. I have had people show up who didn't know they were going to a burial. They thought they were going to a memorial service. It was a very interesting, they're like, what? So anyway, there are opportunities to either do portions of the service indoors. If it's 12 degrees outside, that might be the choice, or if it's pouring buckets, there is an indoor space. There's a gazebo, so you can break it up to accommodate whatever it is you want in terms of ceremony, in addition to just the graveside service. I also have to identify active participants. So I do not have a mechanized means to lower people into the grave. So that it's all manpower. You'll notice my little wagon doesn't have a horse attached. That is all people powered to go transfer people to the grave site. And who those people are, it's typically not an issue, but like six-year-old great-great-grandkids is not an appropriate choice, right? So I don't mind telling you, it is awkward to shift a body on and off the wagon into the grave itself. So they really have to be able to participate. And there's any number of ways that families can participate. So they can do, help transfer or not of the deceased from the vehicle in which it arrived onto the wagon. They can finish up their decorations and add flowers on the gravesite or on the wagon itself. They can be a part of that processional, help lower the body into the grave. And then I provide shovels. If you would like to make the start on closing the grave, you're welcome to do that. It's a lot of work, a big crowd to actually get that done. And so it really does lend itself to a very participatory event. But what if you don't have able-bodied people at the funeral? I do always have at least one individual on standby and can call in others to lend, outside support to make that happen. I really do have a group of people who are like, shoot, I'd come over and help. They might not be dressed for it, but they would be there to assist. Because it's not always going to be the case that there's a large crowd attending. Who wants green burial? Obviously, Anthony covered that to some extent, but I would just say it's universal. It's interesting. I think part of the challenge is more education. There are a few people who I've spoken to about green burial who were like, oh, I would never do that. But the vast majority think it's a grand idea. And why are they doing it? And there could be, again, any number of reasons, but the number one, at least in speaking to people, and I think it was on your slide as well, environmental stewardship. People want to give back. They want to give back to the earth. They want to be responsible for help pushing up a tree, or at the very least, they don't want to leave a black smudge on their way out, right? And because it's different people, and you would imagine that ceremonies and rituals should vary by quite a lot. Maybe it's a Buddhist chanting, maybe it's a family sing-along. It could be any number of things. So what happens after you leave? Good question. So as you can see, I mean, it really is a natural area, right? It is not landscaped in the way that other cemeteries are. And you can see that the dirt is mounded here, and that's the responsibility of the cemetery to complete closing the grave and to create that mound. All the dirt that comes out of that grave goes right back on top. And I don't know, it's probably not that easy to see in the picture, but there are actually 3 graves shown. And you can see that the one furthest distant on the right is already much reduced, and they're only 4 months apart in time. So the grave will settle, and over time will be, kind of blend into the surroundings. One of the things I do later, typically a couple of weeks later, or at least a week, I return the copies of the purchase agreement and the receipt for funeral services that I collected on the day of. And the reason for the delay is I am collecting a GPS coordinate on the gravesite so that there is, as part of the burial register, that information, and that the families can navigate to it at any time in the future, because the landscape will change. It will look different. They'll show up and say, where, and you'll be able to go and navigate to that location. And then after that, park is open year round on to dusk. So people are welcome to come and reflect. If you want to do a celebration of life, when other family members come in, you're welcome to do so. It's worth a phone call in advance to make sure that there isn't an active burial on that day, so it's not disrupting anybody. And then certainly, as I mentioned, you can come back when you do have a marker or it's an appropriate time to plant and coordinate to have that those areas placed as well. Those are the responsibility of the family to secure, but I'm certainly, I have tools on site, and I'm certainly willing to help with, where the appropriate location would be. And that is the end of my presentation. Yes.
There we go. Okay. Thank you, Robin. And again, thank both of you, Anthony and Robin. And Robin was so kind this summer to allow us to come on a field trip to the Prudence Memorial Garden. And it is a beautiful place. And I would encourage you to go there. And we've had this wonderful weather. Great day to take great time to take the ferry still. But right now, what we'd like to do is to entertain some questions. So if you want to just, if you look on the bottom, you can raise your hand if you have a question. And then what I will do is I will mute myself, and depending on who the question is directed to.
Janet, I just wanted to give Karl.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Also, to speak a little bit if he.
Karl, do you want to come up here? Sure. Great. Thank you, Anne. Okay. I didn't mean to leave you out, Karl. There you go.
Live, or is it Memorex?
There you go.
That shows you how old I am. I represent the Arnold Mills Cemetery Association in Cumberland, Rhode Island. It's on Nate Whipple Highway. At one end of our country setting, as I like to call it, we have a historic Methodist church. Smack dab in the middle of our property, we have a modern Masonic lodge. And then on the other side, we have 6 acres of only which 1/2 acre is developed. We started in 1820 There are some famous names buried with us, as I'm sure there are in Swan Point also. And by the way, my thanks to both Robin and Anthony, because they did an excellent presentation. I don't know how you could have a question because they covered every base there was. We are kind of a laid-back cemetery. It's a hybrid. We do every type of burial you can imagine. I give people a choice when it comes to green burials. We have a nicely green grass mowed section, or they can have nature's rough area, of which we have 5 acres. So far, everybody, there's only been 5. So far, everybody has chosen a nice green grass area because it gets mowed every 2 weeks and it's sprinkled so it stays nice and green. And we do allow some sort of a headstone. It can be, I suggest they put a flat one in, but we do allow slant stones if they wish. No one has done it yet, but we do allow it. We have done unusual burials. I have had a gentleman buried in the biggest Chivas Regal bottle I've ever seen. It was about 4 feet high. And we've had people in tackle boxes and other things. So as I say, we're kind of laid back. We tend to be anti-tree. I know that's a romantic thing that everybody loves, but trees have leaves. Leaves create problems. And also when you go to dig, sometimes you run into a root system that pretty difficult to, you have to cut the roots, the tree dies, now what are you gonna do? But anyway, there's no paid positions in our cemetery, everybody's a volunteer. Because of that, we are very reasonable. Our most expensive burial would be $1,600. And we start at $350. So if you're interested in coming to the northern half of Rhode Island, the Arnold Mills Cemetery would love to have you. I'm retired, so I can show up anytime that you do. Just give me a call and I'll be there and we can talk about the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karl.
Thank you, Karl. And I'll be sure to have Karl's information and Robin's and Anthony's, everyone who is on Zoom and that we have an email for. We'll send that out to you so that you'll have that information if you want to contact them. And so you see that you have a lot of choices when it comes to green burial. And as one of our board members who titled our presentation today, Green at Last, you definitely have some choices that you can make. And thank you, Bill, for that. But again, if you have any questions, I would agree with Karl that we've covered a lot of bases, but some of you may have some questions. And if you'd like to, I'm just going to go to gallery so I can see if you put your hand up at all. Does anyone have a question today?
Richard has a question.
Oh, there's Richard, and I'm just going to mute myself so that Richard can.
Okay, my question, when we have the rule about everything has to be biodegradable, these days a lot of people have metal in their bodies from fusions. I know 4 people who have internal permanent pieces of metal. And I, in fact, myself had for a year a plate in my wrist from a broken wrist. And if I had died that year, what is the policy on something like that, which will not biodegrade? Is the person still eligible?
So Richard, we don't at Swan Point restrict that. You know, a lot of these implants are titanium and so forth, not biodegradable, but it's going to be impossible to sort of virtually determine if somebody does, and to have that sort of prosthetic element removed is very challenging. So we don't restrict that based on the fact that these graves are permanent. You know, we offer them in perpetuity. They're never going to be opened up again. So, you know, as I said during my presentation, there are a number of shades of green, and we wouldn't restrict an individual being buried there. It's part of them, and it will not be disturbed in the future.
I'm going to chime in as well.
Sure.
Yeah, so just a quick, I mean, the same is true for me. I mean, there are some in the green burial movement who would say, that's all gotta go.
And I'm not one of them. That is a part of, you've been living with it for who knows how long. I wouldn't even ask if that was a consideration. I mean, obviously I am reusing graves after 60 years, and it might be interesting to find something at the bottom of the grave in the process of that, but that is, it's not certainly not a restriction.
Okay, thank you. And Allie, would you like to ask your question? You have to unmute yourself, Allie.
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I have a question for either Robin or Anthony. I noticed as part of your presentation, there was something about cremation and scattering, and both of you kind of, maybe I didn't hear, but you seem to just skip over that, but I would like to understand that better. So in other words, is someone able to be cremated and then have their ashes scattered in some area of the green area of the park, or how does that work?
So Allie, at Swan Point, we have a designated scattering garden for cremated remains. So if an individual wanted to be scattered, we would direct them in that sort of to that particular area of the cemetery. In the green burial area, we won't allow that. They have to be buried in a biodegradable container. In the area that we scatter cremated remains, we truly do scatter them above grade, so they're relatively visible. And so they're in a very defined spot that needs continued maintenance and so forth. So they're not particularly sort of apparent when people are visiting. So we don't allow it in the green burial space, only a very specific area for scattering of cremated remains in the cemetery.
Yeah, at Prudence Memorial Park, there's a scattering garden. Again, that's kind of on the ground surface, hidden as much as possible, but made of flowers.
I also love people to put cremains and incorporate them into the foundations that are on the property, so you can just tuck them in amongst the stones, and you can inter them. That's a separate kind of burial area, but any of those options works. And then, of course, I think that one thing that's a little different, if you have two individuals who want to be buried together and one is full body burial and one is cremated, I'll tuck them in together.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Okay, Sally.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentations. Oh, my cat. Whatever. What was my question? My question is, about Swan Point. Are you finding more areas where you're going to expand to? Is that part of the plan since your area's limited at this point? And I'm just curious about how you're doing that, and maybe you're going to do it sort of like Mount Auburn Cemetery.
Yeah. Sally, that's a really great question. When we recently developed, I say recently, 5 or 6 years ago, developed a full burial area at the north end of the cemetery, we had to take a lot of forested areas out. And I'm so against that if we can stay away from that. There are areas in the cemetery that are open spaces that we currently cut right now. So you're using mechanized equipment to cut grass. So we'd like to think of looking at those areas for development. And then before even taking, while I'm in charge, before we take any forested areas down, would be to use some of the old pathways in the cemetery world. They call it infilling. So you would find these old pathways that don't get used anymore, or in some cases, old asphalt roads that can come up if they're not being used, and use those spaces for burial. And memorialization monuments have to be similar in design to some of the old areas. But to answer your question, we are looking at future space for burial. Want to leave the periphery of the cemetery alone. That's a very beautiful forested area. And think about some of the intersections of the cemetery to use. It's challenging, you know, Swan Point's got about 50 acres left, but a lot of that's forested area. So we're trying to be very sensitive to that.
Anyone else like that? That's the question. Richard.
Okay, am I on? This is a question for Robin. When you reuse graves, I assume that 60 years skeletal remains have disintegrated. Is that in this climate? Is that true?
It should be true at that depth and in this climate. So in the unlikely event that there's any materials left over after a 60-year period, what the cemetery would do in the absence of any direction from a family member, if we can find one, because they may have a different solution, is we carefully excavate the last foot of the grave and then dig a shallow trench and relay the bones in that area and then bury on top. So they're not removed from the site. They're just carefully extricated and allowed to remain. I do think it's rather unlikely that there would be anything remaining after a period of 60 years. We could have gone for a shorter time frame, but myself and my advisory committee, and we went back and forth with this a lot. We could have gone as short a time as 25 years with confidence that there would be nothing remaining. We selected 60 years because it's really a 2-generation timeline. So don't want to disturb anybody who's seen, you know, their mother or grandmother laid to rest. Leave it be, and then after they've also passed, reuse the grave. I'm hoping it'll be longer than 60 years anyway. Let's see.
Thank you, Dana. I would like to say that with this presentation will be on our website, maybe in about a month, you know, give us a little bit of time to organize that and get it up there, but so that you can view it again. And we do have many people who could not be here today, either because of the weather or they had other, the gorgeous weather, or they had other plans. That they'll be able to view it as well. Or maybe you have a friend who would like to see that. Again, I will be sure to get you the contact information for Anthony, for Robin, and for Karl. And anything else from anyone in our audience that you'd like me to share, Fred? Okay. And then Anne would like to have some final words. So I would like to thank you all so much for showing up today and for being so patient with
Excuse me, Janet, I think Mary had something, but she seems to have disappeared.
I didn't see. Oh, well, maybe she'll put it in the chat, or maybe she'll email me. I'll get in touch with her. Thank you, Allie, for noticing that. I'll email her. But I would like to thank all of you for our first time with having two presenters in a hybrid situation. So I hope everybody was able to hear everything, and we weren't too with our echoes for too long.
Thank you, Janet. Janet always comes through to help us with the technology and the secretarial records and all of that. So she's priceless to us. And I would also like to mention that this event was supported by ThriveNet, who is their logo is on our t-shirts that they donate to us as well. And it's to live generously. And we are very grateful to them. I would like to mention the names of the people on our board as well. My name is Dr. Ann Porto. I've been on the board for about 6.5, maybe 7 years now. I've lost count. Fred Grafe, Amanda Herpole, Janet Larson, William Olkers, Sally Barney, and of course, Dana Delbonis, who is one of those very persistent people that Anthony mentioned when we went on the field trip to Swan Point. And we are eternally grateful for our speakers today. And we were lucky we got a bonus third person to speak to us, Karl Ikerman at Swan, at the Cumberland Cemetery. And there is the Stearns Memorial section there, which is the green burial section. So I encourage all of you that have attended today to take a field trip, as Dana would say, take 3 field trips, one to Cumberland, one to Swan Point Cemetery in Providence, and also to beautiful Prudence Island. It's so easy to get to. I was surprised at how short the ferry boat ride was. It was beautiful. And all 3 of these people are committed to green burial. So I am so grateful to them for showing up today and doing this for us. I think that's a wrap. As Janet said, if there's any questions or anything, please do check out our website and our email. You can email us as well. And we hope to answer any of your questions in the future. And this, as she said, is going to be recorded. So you can direct it to friends and people who were not able to see it today. Once again, thank you to the speakers. And from my heart to you, take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody, and get outside to enjoy this beautiful afternoon.
Thank you so much, everybody.